Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get started.
Okay.
So, first of all, hi everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. Before I hand it off to the presenter, I just want to say if you could take a look at our events calendar. We have a couple more events this month that are not full yet. We have some open spots for our maple syrup program, just about how to make it and the history of it as well. And then we have a Music of Motor City event in a couple weeks on a Wednesday night. So if you like live music, that should be really exciting. And then I have some stuff going on in April on the calendar as well. So you could check that out and see if you're interested in anything. Um, so without further ado, I will hand it off to Shetan Noir, who's going to give a presentation on Detroit's Nain Rouge. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you and welcome everyone to my presentation tonight. I'm hoping everybody has at least heard of the Nain Rouge, but if you haven't, I'm going to explain him in detail. First, a little bit about myself. My name is Shetan Noir, and I am the owner of Squatch GQ Publications. And I company, Paranormal Magazine, Dinosauria and Prehistoric Creatures magazine, Rock Hound and Prospector magazine, and a new magazine called The Hound's Tooth, which is kind of a more upscale canine magazine featuring travel and leisure and lifestyle articles, for living and traveling with your dogs. So I am also an author, and I've written books on lake monsters and odd creatures of the Great Lakes, and also Mothman and other flying creatures of the Midwest. I will be coming out with both a book and a documentary movie about the Nain Rouge within the next 6 months. So if you're interested in this topic, please follow me on Facebook at Shetan Noir, and you will be kept up to date with when the book will be out, when the documentary will be out, and also any future magazines that I produce and have available. So now we're going to get into the presentation tonight, and I would like to introduce our creature of the evening. He is the devil of the Straits, the red dwarf, Detroit's anti-hero, the Nain Rouge. So a lot of people ask, what exactly is the Nain Rouge? And we have two possible explanations for what he is. You can either look at it from the French settlers' perspective of he was a Lutin type creature, and we're going to focus on that for right now because the first half of his story really has to do with the French settlers who traveled over here and a particular captain of the fort whose last name was Cadillac. And yes, that Cadillac that people still drive around today. So the family crest and the emblem on the Cadillac are the exact same. So what is a lutin? Our broadest definition of what a lutin is it's a type of hobgoblin. And the females are called lutins. But that is a very umbrella term because also in the term of lutins are brownies, elves, fairies, gnomes, goblins, hobgoblins, imps, leprechauns, pucks, and sprites. Now, one of the key factors with a lutin's behavior is they are usually associated with causing mischief, causing catastrophes, and they seem to have an issue with horses, which, I'm going to touch on that briefly later in the program, but they seem to like to torment horses quite a bit. Now, here are some classic images of what are actually Lutins, but we see as the Keebler elves, hobgoblins, leprechauns, one that I will be talking about later this evening, the Pukwudgies, and of course, the guest of honor at the presentation tonight, the Nain Rouge. Now, our legends and stories of the Nain Rouge don't really start in Detroit. They actually start in the first mention of him ever recorded by French settlers or white settlers is back in the early 1700s. And this is when the governor of what was called New France at that time, Quebec, was holding a very lavish party as a send-off for a group of people who are going to be traveling to what we now know as the city of Detroit. And they were going to build a fort there and start basically a trading post. And Monsieur Lamothe Cadillac would be the gentleman leading this entourage of people, and would, once the fort was built, he would be the man in charge. Now, as fate would have it, on that night, an old fortune teller came to the door insisting that she could read palms. And she introduced herself as Nier Mercure, le sorcerer. And she was complete with even a black cat sitting on her shoulder. And here is a painting of that very occasion. Now, before they let her in, the men were quite skeptical as to if somebody maybe told her who each one was. So the men thought, we'll switch wives with each other, and we'll sit in different areas. That way, hopefully, she won't know who each one of us are and what our status is. So eventually it did become Cadillac's turn to have his palms read. And his only question to her was, will I have fame and fortune in the future? And she gave him a very long response, which included telling him that he had a strange destiny and it would be a dangerous journey that he would undertake, but he would found a great city, and that great city would go on to have a lot more inhabitants, and it would be a well-known, prosperous city. But she also had a warning for him. And she, told him repeatedly that if he wanted all of these good things to happen, he needed to make a policy of not selling liquors to the Native Americans at that time. And the Jesuit priests also were telling him, do not, sell drug or tobacco or alcohol or trade for it with the savages. But we eventually learned that he didn't listen to this. We also know that she warned him to beware of the Nain Rouge, to beware of offending him, because should he be unfortunate enough to offend the Nain Rouge, upset the Nain Rouge, then a curse would be put on him. And everything that he hoped to pass on in the future to his children would be destroyed. And that the city that he wanted to found and create would either forget him completely, or his name would be associated with tragedy. Now, as luck would have it, his wife overheard this telling of fortune, and she remembered very well the words of the sorceress. But Cadillac seemed more focused on the actual fort, getting people across to where Detroit is now, because that was quite a journey from Quebec, Canada, to the Detroit River, crossing the Detroit River, and then setting up across the shores in what would be a new fort, a new territory for France. These were more important to him than anything that the fortune teller had told him, other than that he would be successful. And then he kind of stopped listening after that, and it didn't dawn on him that he really needed to listen to her whole foretelling. So as he journeys across Canada, across the Detroit River, and settles in on what we now call the city of Detroit, he had 50 soldiers with him, and then 50 artisans and warriors, enough to create a new settlement, enough of a workforce to build a fort. And this was, going to be their grand entrance into what we now call Michigan. The only problem was Cadillac really wanted to take the, Lake Erie up and come up the Detroit River and then land on the other side. But the governor at that time decided otherwise. So they travel across Canada. They eventually make it to Georgian Bay, which is actually higher up in Canada. We're talking more like the Sault Ste. Marie area across from there. And then they travel downriver to what eventually becomes Detroit. And they would have been traveling in these great big canoes. Now, as they reach Detroit and they immediately start breaking up the ground, cutting down trees to build the fort, this is where the Native American thoughts on the Nain Rouge start to take effect, because the Native Americans believed that the Nain Rouge at that time was a stone god. And they had built various altars to him near the Detroit shoreline and near Belle Isle. And unfortunately, when Jesuit priests traveled through the area, when they would find one of these altars, they would tear it down and desecrate it and destroy it. and usually put a crucifix or a cross up in its place, which not only angered the Native Americans and caused quite a bit of discontent between the Native Americans and the French settlers and the Jesuit priests, but this also is what starts to manifest into physical form the Nain Rouge. And this is a statue of Monsieur Cadillac in Hart Plaza. And there's also a plaque dedicated to his landing. Now, after they get the fort built and they get a commerce going, they get the trading post going, Cadillac soon decides that, you know, he's in charge of the fort and that puts him in, you know, control of everything. So he decides that he's going to start charging all the settlers, all the fur traders, all the artists who came there to help build a new city, that he's going to start charging them a tax, charging them a rent. Either they paid money or they had to give up the goods and crops that they were raising. And even the fur traders who came in to barter had to pay an initial fee or excess of goods in order to be able to trade there. So it didn't take too long before people living in the settlement within the fort started to really dislike Cadillac. And it got to the point where the settlers who were dealing with this decided enough was enough and started talking more and more about the fortune teller and the Nain Rouge and wondering when the Nain Rouge would make its appearance. Now, on the evening of 1707, Cadillac and his wife were walking along and they heard some of the villagers talking about the Nain Rouge and how they wished he would come, not necessarily to destroy the fort and the settlement, but to teach Cadillac a lesson. Now, Cadillac was very arrogant at this time, but the one factor that he didn't contend with was that when the Jesuit priests would come into the settlement to minister to the settlers and give them religious ceremonies, church services, that a lot of the settlers were telling the Jesuit priests that Cadillac was not only selling and trading the Native Americans for tobacco and alcohol products, but he was encouraging it. So this immediately sets the Jesuit priests to their letters, to their pens and letters, and letters immediately are sent by messenger. This is the 1700s, back to the King and Queen of France, telling of Cadillac's illicit behavior of allowing the Native Americans to partake in drugs and alcohol, because at that time, tobacco was considered a drug. And they probably had access to other things that were brought with the French settlers. At that time, cocaine was not only being processed and used, but it was considered safe. So once again, we see things that today we know are really bad, but back then it was acceptable. So as we go back to that night, Cadillac shrugs off, hearing the talking of the settlers, because he really doesn't care. He's in charge and nobody is going to tell him otherwise. And he proceeds to tell his wife so. And so they decide that they're going to go for a walk outside the fort along the Detroit River. And as they are doing so, suddenly this creature that they describe as a demon scrambles into their path. And he was described as having a very red face with these bright, glistening eyes and razor sharp teeth. And he just had this ominous appearance to him. Now, what proceeds next is the creature picks up a stick and challenges Cadillac to a duel. Now, unfortunately, Cadillac was armed with a better stick. He actually had a cane. And as they dueled and did their basically stick fight, Cadillac broke the Nain Rouge's stick and then told him to get out of his way, and then proceeded to beat the Nain Rouge with his cane. And it's said that it was after this point that the Nain Rouge disappeared from sight, but left ringing in the night's air was this fiendish mocking laugh. And it's after that that we see Cadillac's life start to take a change. Because by now, the letters of his trading for alcohol and tobacco with the Native Americans have reached his superiors. Not only the governor of New France, but also the king and queen of France. And he is very quickly brought before the magistrate. And when people testify against him, they report that he is very quarrelsome. He lies. He is always telling fibs. He's charging them too much money. And so as punishment, Cadillac is sent up to the Straits of Mackinac. But he doesn't change his behaviors at all. And soon the people up there who are at the fort up there are reporting the same things to the Jesuit priests, who then proceed to report to the governor in New France, who then proceeds to report to the king and queen of France. And it's at this point that they decide, well, Cadillac needs to learn a lesson in humility. So from the what we would consider pleasant atmosphere of Michigan, they sent him to Louisiana, which he complains to everyone near and far that it is a wretched place full of swamp and mosquitoes and things that will eat you. And the atmosphere in New Orleans is all voodoo, and it's not a place for a man of the cross. And so after making many complaints for many years, Cadillac is then stripped of all of his titles, and he travels back to France. And it's said that he ends up dying in the streets without a penny to his name. Now, fortunately, his children were able to distance themselves from their father by simply going to different towns, and when questioned about it, if they were related to him, say, no, no, we're not related to that Cadillac. Where our family comes from a different part of France. And so back in the 1700s, you could get away with this. It was very easy to basically go to a new town, especially if it was a large city, and recreate your whole identity. And initially, that is what Cadillac actually did. He traded in his life in France for a new and different name and title in New France, and was able to impress the people in charge in New France, which eventually became Quebec. And that's how he gained his status and his titles. And he may have done very well in life, but he was never very good at humility. And so when he was warned of the Nain Rouge, of the wrath of the Nain Rouge, of the curse of the Nain Rouge, he just brushed it off and decided that it wasn't worth his consideration. And while his children went on to be the namesake for the automobile that we see driven still to this day with the name of Cadillac on it, he never enjoyed any of that success. Now, as we're dealing with the Native American aspect of the Nain Rouge, we can see how if he were a Lutin and he had traveled with the French settlers across the oceans into Canada and became established in Quebec, their concept of a Lutin might apply to this creature, because Lutins can be good, they can be bad, they can be neutral. With leprechauns, we see a very greedy creature, but they also are cobblers at trade. And so it's said that if you leave out shoes that need repaired, they will repair the shoes, but they will also guard their gold. But if you go to Scotland, where the red cap, a very similar creature, lives, you go from the leprechaun of Ireland, who is all in green, sometimes gold, to the red cap, who is in bloodstained clothing, and he lives around ancient ruins, and his thirst and quest for violence and wars is so great that if you come across him, he will try to kill you. But then you go down to Italy, where a very similar looking creature lives in the wineries called the Moncello, and this creature is very laid back. The only thing it wants to do is sit in the winery and drink wine, and is considered kind of a guardian of the winery, but a little bit self-indulgent. They will drink a bottle of wine whenever they can grab it. And then we've got our Nain Rouge, who is always appearing in red, and red face, red clothing, red or yellow eyes. And usually the first reports reported him having very sharp, very vicious looking teeth, and more modern reports report his teeth are rotting. But we have to look at the history of this creature. If he was born in the 1700s and he's still seen to this day, he might have rotting teeth at this point. I'm willing to give him that one. But the Nain Rouge, the red dwarf, the demon of the Straits, we see folk tales and legends and stories of him, both from the French settlers and the Native Americans, and as a modern day entity. Now, the picture currently on the screen, this is from the March du Nain Rouge, which this year I believe is March 26th. And he is depicted as shown on the screen here. A very goblin-like creature, kind of cool looking, but definitely a little bit sinister looking. Now, some different legends that are associated with the Nain Rouge going back in history tells of a murder that happened on Christmas Day when two Native American braves were said to race the frozen straits for the hand of a woman named Claire. But when her lover's horse, which was a Native American horse, came to the finish line, it wouldn't stop, and instead carried off the winner, and they were never able to catch it. We don't know whatever happened to the gentleman. We just know that he goes missing, but the horse is then seen galloping across the rooftop of stables and leaping from building to building. And it's said that the Nain Rouge was influencing this horse. We also see a report of a horse that was called Sansucha. And it was claimed that this horse was over 100 years old, and it was able to leap any wall, including the 12-foot stockades of the fort. And it would usually steal corn and watermelons. And at different times, people had seen it sitting at a table in the barn playing 7-Up with its master. And sometimes this animal was said to drink what looked like melted brass. But it was also claimed that at that time, the Sansucha was the favorite stolen ride of the Nain Rouge. And when she wasn't leaping walls or galloping across buildings, her owners and the neighbors would often find her in the paddock or in the field, covered in sweat with a snarled mane and knots in her tail, and her just looking wild. Now, the Nain Rouge was also said to have a part in the death of an old friar named Constantine, when he told the Native American chief that the friar was trying to change all their religions and trying to convert the Native Americans to the Christian religion. And so the chief took action. And while all this was happening, his daughter ended up drowning herself. Now, it's said that after the friar was murdered, you could still hear his voice in the wind along the Detroit River. Another report speaks of an old mill on Presque Island. And at that time, there was a woman named Josette who actually owned the mill, but her brother would not stop pestering her about taking over ownership of the mill. Now, Josette was sick, and this was causing her quite a bit of irritation. And so on the night of her death, she called upon the devil, some say it was the Nain Rouge, to destroy the mill. And it said upon her death, the mill was wrecked and destroyed by a thunderbolt. And the red-faced imp, the Nain Rouge, was often seen among the ruins. And he would patch up the machinery, and they would call it the devil's grist. And people reported this, but they also reported that there was always black cats around the mill. And eventually this became known as Point Rouge. Now, eventually people were able to buy the property and rebuild the mill, but everybody who was associated with it ended up becoming sick or starving to death or just having really bad luck at that old mill. Now this, the next legend I'm going to talk about is one I remember hearing as a child. They referred to the Nain Rouge more as a lutin. So this would be from French folklore or our French settling folklore. And it's a story about a horseman named Jacques L. Esperance, who had a stable of ponies. Now, at that time, or this word could apply to anything from ponies to horses to donkeys. But he had a stable in Grosse Pointe, and he would often find his horses missing, and there would be no tracks left in the sand or snow. And it was said that they would ride through the air at night, and the Nain Rouge would leave them back in the stable, but they would be quivering with exhaustion, covered with foam, bloody with the lash of a thorn bush. And Jacques wanted to stop this activity because these were his prized possessions. And the horse or pony that was being affected the most was actually his prized horse. It was so bad that he couldn't even brush the snarls out of his horse's mane or tail. And upon talking to different people, it was suggested, get a bottle of holy water and pour that all the way around your stable. And this will keep the Nain Rouge from taking your horses out at night. And so Jacques went about getting a large bottle of holy water, but he's questioning, if this isn't the Nain Rouge and it's a human being stealing my horses and riding them this hard, how is holy water going to, solve this problem? And he becomes, to the point where he's questioning himself and, should I, shouldn't I? But he finally decides there's no harm in it. So just before dark, he walks down to his stable. And as he is getting ready to start pouring the water, the doors of the stable fling open, and here is the Nain Rouge sitting upon the back of his favorite steed. And the horse is already panicking and trembling and going wild. And so Jacques, in a justifiable fit of outrage, throws the bottle of holy water at the Nain Rouge and strikes him with it, splashing the water all over the Nain Rouge. And the Nain Rouge leaps from the back of the horse and goes scurrying off And from that point on, he never has an issue with the Nain Rouge stealing his horses and riding them all night long from that point on. It's also said that a lot of people in Grosse Pointe whose families are of French descent, they still mark their houses with the sign of a cross as a barrier to keep the Nain Rouge away. Now, on July 1763, the Nain Rouge was seen before the Battle of Bloody Run, where 60 British soldiers were killed by Chief Pontiac and his tribe. The Nain Rouge was laughing and dancing on the banks. It's said that the water from the tributaries ran red from blood and flowed into the Detroit River. And this is possibly why the Rouge River got its name. Nain Rouge, Rouge River, rivers that run, red with blood from these battles that Nain Rouge was said to influence. There was also the Captain Dalzell, who went against Pontiac in the same battle and ended up perishing in the ambush. Now, unbeknownst to Dalzell, his superior, Major Gladwin, was really hoping that Captain Dalzell would meet his end, because Gladwin was very infatuated with the betrothed of Dalzell. Unfortunately, when the girl heard that her lover had been killed at Bloody Run, she fell to the ground, and it said that within a few days she also perished because she was so heartbroken that she just couldn't continue on living. Now, in the spring of 1805, an infamous fire raged through Detroit's neighborhoods and buildings, burning to the ground the once thriving city. And it said that the Nain Rouge was seen by many horrified citizens, and he was seen celebrating in the streets while the city burned, and the people around him lost everything they owned. And it's at this point that we start to consider him the bringer of doom. And people at that time dreaded any mention of him, and they feared anybody reporting a sighting of him, because that meant something terrible was going to happen. Now, in 1813, General Hull was said to have seen the Nain Rouge running along the ramparts of his fort right before a big battle with the British. It should also be noted that General Hull is the only American general who has ever been sentenced to death for cowardice and incompetence. He surrendered his fort, the city of Detroit, and all of his troops to the British because he claimed to have seen the Nain Rouge, and decided that the battle was already lost and just gave up. And this is a picture of General Hull. Also in 1967, it was said that the Nain Rouge was seen dancing in the streets. And this was during the riots of Detroit. He was apparently encouraging people to destroy the city. About 10 years later, in March of 1976, two utility workers were up on an electrical pole tending to the lines because there was a report that a huge snowstorm was coming in. When one of the workers noticed something odd below them, and at first he thought a young child was climbing up the pole underneath of them, and they quickly started shouting at him to get down, that it was dangerous. And then the terror set in because what they thought was this dirty child dressed in red looked up at them, and they could see that this creature had these yellow eyes and sharp rotting teeth. And it said that the movements of the creature, they immediately knew that this wasn't a child, and that the Nain Rouge, after they yelled at it, jumped down from the pole and scampered off while laughing at the men. And the next day, the city of Detroit was hit by the blizzard of 1976, and there was a citywide blackout. Now, when the Nain Rouge appears, he is always described as wearing tattered red clothing, usually no more than 3 feet tall. His eyes are a blazing yellow or red, sometimes described as glittering. His teeth were once very sharp and vicious looking, but now they appear more rotten. And his face is always a very bad sunburnt red. It's claimed that wherever he goes, wherever he appears, disaster follows him. Now, Native American legends say that the Nain Rouge was created by the Great Manitou, and that he was a protective spirit evoked after the early Jesuit priests came to native lands and destroyed their sacred lands and burial mounds and placed their crucifixes on the sites. Now, whether the Nain Rouge is of French descent or Native American, he's here to stay in Detroit. And while we have the march for him every March, and we follow him through the streets of Detroit, usually from Traffic Jam and Snug to the Detroit Masonic Temple. And even though after he's done criticizing the crowd, insulting the crowd, and they put him in handcuffs, put him in a Toyota, and send him down to Toledo, he still finds a way to make it back here to Michigan. And he's becoming more and more of a nuisance because a couple of months ago, now the meeting place for the beginning of the parade has always been Traffic Jam and Snug, and this has been so for the last 8 years. But a couple of months ago, the restaurant, the Traffic Jam and Snug, mysteriously caught fire and was damaged to the point where they had to close. Now, knowing the Nain Rouge, knowing how he likes to affect things, I can only hypothesize that the Nain Rouge was probably playing with matches and trying to get us so that we couldn't take him to Toledo. But if you want to join us at the parade and take part in the activities, everybody can join the parade. Usually people show up dressed in red, but dressed for the weather. And that website that I have there in blue, that keeps all the current information. They also have a Facebook page, the Marche du Nain Rouge, and that will keep you up to date with all the details. But if you're not doing anything on March 26th and you want to take part in a purely Detroit event, then by all means, show up at the Marche du Nain Rouge. I will be there, and hopefully we can chase him out of town and take him to Toledo, and maybe he might take longer getting back this year. Now, let's see. I do have a little bit of time. So one of the other Lutin creatures that we have that actually is a Native American, North American creature is a creature called the Pukwudgie. Now, these creatures do not appear in any specific color. Actually, they are very rarely wearing clothing. They are very feral, very wild. They are only about 12 inches tall at their tallest. And there are reports of these creatures all over the United States, including Alaska. And it's said that they only interact with people who are on wooded paths or walking near the woods. And they are always beckoning to people to follow them, to come closer to them. And sometimes if you're actually in the wood on a trail, they will try hunting you. It's said that they have little arrows that they shoot at people. And once they take you, you never come back. They use you as some type of servant wherever they actually live. And so if you're ever in the woods or you're walking along a path and you see a very small humanoid type creature and it's beckoning you to come closer or to follow it, my advice is to turn around and move as fast as you can away from the creature, unless you want to go on a really strange adventure that you may never come back from. So be aware of the Pukwudgies, be aware of the Nain Rouge, and I hope you guys enjoyed my presentation tonight.
Thank you so much, Shetan. That was really awesome information. I had never heard of the Nain Rouge, to be honest. So this was really interesting. And the Marche, I guess my question is, so is it an all day type of event or like
you have to, so it can be an all day because people do show up early.
Gotcha.
Everybody gathers in the parking lot and street right there at Traffic Jam and Snug. And you'll have there's going to be like different marching bands. Not school marching bands, but just bands that come together to march down the street and play. It's very similar to a New Orleans second line band. Where they just march down the street during funeral processions. But there'll be a couple of bands. There will be different floats that people put together and people dressed in red. There will be performers. And generally we're chasing the Nain Rouge. He leads the parade, and different years it's a different kind of procession. The first year they did it, he rode on the back of a big mechanical dragon that breathed fire.
Wow.
And then the next year it was a chop shop car. So just different things every year. One year it was a car that looked like a beetle or a cockroach. So interesting, just interesting. And then there is so the parade itself meanders around the neighborhoods of Cass Quarter, from Traffic Jam and Snug down to the Detroit Masonic Temple. And then there's usually an after party inside the Detroit Masonic Temple.
Nice. That's cool. And you said March 26th, correct?
Yes, it's on a Sunday. Check the website and the Facebook page for the actual schedule of events. And because I'm not sure what time the parade starts, I have to check that myself. But yeah, it is definitely worth attending.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
If anybody has any questions, you can feel free to go ahead and ask, or you can write it in the chat if you're more comfortable. Um, if there aren't any questions, then we will wrap things up, but I'll give you a minute just in case. Let's see.
Is there any, let's check the chat. real
Has
quick.
anyone captured a picture of a pukwudgie in Michigan?
Not in Michigan. There was a
I know,
picture.
Jeff
there-
Fett captured one in New York.
Well, there's a picture of one that supposedly was captured in, I think it was Minnesota or Wisconsin. And it's a very small creature. And they're said to be so small that they can actually go up ferns, and that's how they watch you. Some of them are claimed to be green in color, so that they, you know, blend in with the plants, but they will either watch you as you are walking around, or they will beckon at you to come to them.
Oh, that's scary.
That was my only question.
Okay.
All right. If there aren't any more questions, then thank you so much for coming tonight and being a part of this. And thank you, Shetan. That was really awesome.
Oh, you
And
are welcome.
this presentation will also be on our YouTube for a certain amount of time, not forever. So if you want to share it with any of your friends, you can feel free to do that and check out our channel. Yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thank you. And I hope everybody enjoyed the presentation. And if you want more presentations like this, feel free to contact either Lyons Township Public Library or your own local library. I do travel, or I can do Zoom, and I would be more than glad to do presentations for different libraries. So, or even to come back to Lyons Township and do either in-person or Zoom presentations. So I'm always available.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I hope you have a good night, everybody.